A man was convicted based on DNA evidence, but he would like you to think that he was still not the killer. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Krystal Naab. Viewer discretion is advised. Real quick before we get started, of course, hello, my name is Mike. I tell multiple true crime stories here a week on YouTube, so please subscribe if you're into that kind of thing. I also tell short-form true crime stories over on TikTok. That will be linked below in the description in my link tree, and at some point it'll be up here to click on easily. I also have my Discord server in my link. Feel free to join it, but be over the age of 18. I also sell merch. We ship all over the world. That's also in the link tree below. And then lastly, if there's a case you want me to cover, please just email me at makingatruecrimerertwo. That is listed below as well. Just send me the name of the person, where it happened, when it happened, and I'll add it to my list. I pick the cases I cover at random, to be fair. I will get to it eventually. I just cannot promise you when. Anyway, let's get into today's case. Krystal Lynn Naab was born on August 9th, 1974, and she was born and raised and pretty much lived her entire life in Illinois. And at the time of this case, she was living specifically in Ramsey. She was one of, I think, 3 total children. She had a brother and a sister, and by the time that this case happens, it's 1991, and she is 16 years old, and the family is living in a trailer. It was July of 1991. She had just finished up her sophomore year of school, and she was really just getting started with her summer vacation. She loved to help out, I guess, the older people in the community. She liked to volunteer to help them. She also loved being around kids, babysitting kids, and she was just a really independent young girl. She also had a boyfriend at the time, and apparently it was going really well, and she was very smitten with him, and I guess the plan was to one day marry this guy, but that would never get to happen. At approximately 4 p.m. on July 23rd, 1991, Krystal's brother Curtis would come home to the trailer, open the door, and he found his sister Krystal lying in a massive pool of blood on the floor. She had been murdered. She was dead. Despite all the blood and everything and not really realizing she was dead at that exact time, he tried to, revive her and help her, but obviously he couldn't. He would leave the trailer, go right next door to the neighbors, and call 911. Police arrive, and they confirm that Krystal is in fact deceased. They noticed that the phone cord had been ripped out of the wall. There was a pair of very bloody scissors on the countertop. There was a lot of blood around Krystal, but it appeared like everything around her outside of that, it looked like whoever did this to her had actually tried to clean up. There was evidence of a lot of cleaning going on. They did determine that the murder weapon was the pair of scissors. The coroner would later state that Krystal had been stabbed a staggering 81 times. This was a brutal slaying. This was someone who clearly hated Krystal, or had some kind of animosity towards her. This was horrific. The coroner would basically tell the detectives, listen, if someone is taking a pair of scissors and stabbing someone 81 times, they are going to slip in all the blood, and they're going to get cut. The killer likely cut themselves with the scissors, but it wouldn't have been like a knife, slit, like in a palm or anything like that. It would have been likely the killer would probably have some kind of like puncture wounds on their hand, which would then leave blood, which could then mean that the blood mixed in with Krystal's blood. When police interviewed neighbors, they said there were a few neighbors who said they saw a small white pickup truck that was parked outside of the Naab trailer between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. It was there for quite some time, but no one in the Naab residence owned a white pickup truck, so it wasn't theirs. So police would interview the brother Curtis, and they told him, like, hey, do you know anyone with a white pickup truck? He says, well, as a matter of fact, I do. An old friend of mine named Stuart Heaton, but I haven't seen him in about 2 or 3 years. but I do know that he had a white pickup truck. This seems odd to me. I hadn't seen someone in 2 to 3 years. For some reason, because he said his name quick. He was like, Stuart Heaton. He has a white truck, but I haven't seen him in 3 years. I don't know if that would be the first person I would think of in that case. If I hadn't seen him in so long. He was quick to point him out, though. He had said that Stuart Heaton and him used to be friends. He had come over to their house kind of often back in the day. So Stuart knew his sisters. The police had to track down Stuart Heaton, and they found him in Bluff City, Illinois. He was working as a carpenter and a roofer. When they got to his residence, they noticed he does, in fact, still own a 1989 Dodge Dakota pickup. He had a wife of 2 years, and when this happened, his wife was pregnant. When police go to his home, his trailer, they just ask, are you Stuart Heaton? He says yes, and they just immediately slap cuffs on him and basically arrest him. Simply based on the fact that Curtis, Krystal's brother, said, yeah, I know someone who had a white truck. I guess that was it for police. That was it. But anyway, they took him down to the police station where they basically just bombarded him with statements and questions and, why did you do it? And all of this nonsense. And then they look at his hands and they notice he has a couple of fresh looking cuts. When I say cuts, I mean little tiny itty bitty cuts. He has some on the side of his hand, and he has, I think, one on his palm. And that's exactly where the medical examiner said the killer would probably, if he cut himself with the scissors, would have small cuts on the outside of his hand and his palm. Lo and behold, he does happen to have those cuts. So that is pretty odd. That would be some pretty damn good luck if this wasn't the right guy. And they photographed his hands, and so there are, you can see for yourself what these cuts look like, and they're so tiny, and it doesn't look like a cut that would leave a lot of blood, but I don't know. They also took a picture of his forehead, and they said, well, you also have a small cut on your forehead. And he's like, that's not a cut, that's a pimple. And looking at it, I'm like, yeah, that's clearly just like a pimple or a bump on his head. That's not a cut. But they took it as he cut himself in the head, I guess, with the scissors. I don't understand their logic there, but it is what it is. So police had asked him, because they basically had arrested him the night of the murder or the next day or something like that. So they asked him, hey, where were you during, this time frame? He says, well, at 9 a.m. I go into work at the lumber yard. And that was in Vandalia, Illinois. And he also explained that's the reason why he had his little nicks on his hand is because he's a carpenter. He works with tools, and you're not a good carpenter if you don't have nicks on your hand, which is true. He said he had ran several errands that day. And then he claims he would later visit his wife at the place where she worked. Her coworkers would say that was actually kind of unusual. He didn't really do that. And he did seem a little out of sorts when he came in to visit his wife. He just seemed kind of scattered. Now, mind you, this would have been hours after Krystal was killed. But police, after they interrogate him, he says, I didn't do this. I had nothing to do with it. I'm innocent. And they didn't have any physical evidence, really. So they had to let him go. The coroner would state that the puncture wounds on his hand were pretty much identical to a lot of the puncture wounds found on Krystal's body. Same shape, same size. If the scissors were opened and one of the blades had nicked his hand, and that's probably because the killer had likely stabbed her with the closed scissors, but also at one point had opened them several times and did it like that. Now, some witnesses would state that the truck they saw parked outside of the Naab residence that day was identical to Stuart's truck. But then other witnesses who also saw the truck said, it actually looks kind of different. That's not the truck I completely remember seeing. So you had conflicting reports on that. But then the mailman would come forward to police to state that he had dropped off mail at 12:25 p.m. at the Naab residence, and actually he saw Krystal alive and well, and she had waved to him, and she seemed fine. And also he saw the white pickup truck right outside their trailer, and he recognized that pickup truck as for sure being Stuart Heaton's truck. However, when he was initially questioned, the mailman, he never once mentioned the truck. He just stated that he had seen Krystal at the trailer and had waved to him, and they use it as a point of reference and time frame as to when she would have been killed. Other witnesses would state that they saw the white pickup truck speeding away from the house or speeding down the road near the house. On September 11th, 1991, Stuart Heaton was officially indicted and charged with the first-degree murder of Krystal Naab. And once he was arrested, they were able to take his blood for DNA testing. The autopsy of Krystal also showed that she was 3 months pregnant. And there was also signs that she had recently had sexual intercourse, and they found semen in her pubic hair. They would test that DNA, and they could, at that point, they can only get DNA typing or blood type. They couldn't say, this is definitely this person's DNA. They were able to eliminate the semen from being her actual boyfriend because he did not have the same blood type as what was there. So that means another man had intercourse with her, whether that was voluntary or that was an assault. But it also raises the questions like who would have been the father of the baby? Is this the motive for the crime? Who knows? The initial autopsy could not really show whether or not she had been sexually assaulted or not. So they took his DNA, and back in 1991, it took a long time. I guess it still takes a long time, but he was sitting in a jail cell for like 4 or 5 months while this DNA is being run. And he was like, okay, this is going to clear me because it's not going to be mine. But when they got the results back finally, it showed that there was a chance that Stuart Heaton's DNA could have contributed to the same DNA left on Krystal's body. They had only run it against the semen, that's what had given them a match, because I guess there was also hair, skin samples, other blood, fingerprints, fibers, there was a bloody palm print, and allegedly none of that actually matched Stuart Heaton. But the semen sample was the one and only thing that pretty much matched him. And if you're going to be this brutal murderer who is allegedly in this house between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m., how do you not leave any trace of yourself around the house or around the body, but only, a semen sample? At the same time, there was evidence that the house was thoroughly cleaned, and he may have just not thought about the semen on the body. And he probably was just busy wiping his fingerprints off of everything and cleaning whatever excess mess he could clean that would have left any trace of him. It is possible. So the DNA test, now again, not as extensive. Were able to eventually kind of advance a little bit to show not just blood typing, but to show a what percent chance of it being this person. So there was, I guess, 1 out of every 52,000 people would have had that same DNA profile that was found on Krystal. 1 in 52,000, I know that sounds like a large number, but that's not solid proof. That actually shows that there are a lot of potential people who could have done this. But you also have the fact that he had the same or similar white pickup truck seen by many, many people. The mailman stated that it was for sure Stuart's truck because he knew Stuart. You also have the fact that the one person out of all the people that could have potentially done this, the one person that the brother had named about owning that white pickup truck just so happens to have these similar cuts on his hand that the coroner would state the killer would likely have. Those are some pretty crazy chances, but he's also a carpenter who works with tools, who works with a lot of stuff like that. So in June of 1992, Stuart Heaton goes on trial for the murder of Krystal Naab. His one-time friend Curtis, Krystal's brother, would testify that apparently Stuart had come to the Naab residence years prior, and Curtis had found Stuart in his sister Melody's bedroom talking privately with her, and Curtis had asked him to leave once he saw that. And apparently Stuart had made the girls in the house feel uncomfortable, and that's kind of what it would eventually lead to like this falling out. And then they would present the evidence of the cuts on his hand. They would present numerous witnesses who would testify about the truck. There were some witnesses who came forward to state that Krystal and Stuart had never actually met before, but then some people had stated that they probably had met before. It was very, very like back and forth. Prosecutors would state that the likely motive for the murder was that Stuart had gone to the residence potentially to ask for sex from Krystal, and she probably said no, and so he reacted and stabbed her to death, despite he at the time being a married man who was expecting his first child. There was also the theory that he may have met Krystal months prior and got her pregnant, hence the fact that she was 3 months pregnant. And they could have used that as a motive of like, well, I can't have that because I'm married with a baby on the way. Could be a motive, but they couldn't prove it. His wife, Stewart's wife, would testify at the trial that the morning of that murder, Stewart was wearing a t-shirt and blue jeans. But when he picked her up from work much later in the day, he was wearing a different shirt and he was wearing sweatpants. And she never found those jeans. Those clothing items have never been found. And so the prosecution theorized that they had obviously gotten very bloody in the murder, and so he destroyed them or hid them somewhere. In terms of his alibi, there were witnesses who stated they saw him kind of maybe in different places throughout the day, but this murder would have only taken a small window of time to actually do, and so there wasn't enough of an alibi, like proof of an alibi, to show where he was at every moment of the day, that there was absolutely numerous windows of time, long windows of time throughout that day where he could have done this. And then the DNA came into play, and that's when, the experts would come forward to state that the DNA found on Krystal's body compared to Stewart's known DNA sample, there was that 1 in 52,600 person chance of it being him, which today we would say that is not convincing whatsoever. But back then, when DNA was still very, very new, that did sound convincing. They even showed the little slides of like the DNA found on the body compared to Stewart's DNA, and they lined them up and they said, look at that, it's a perfect match. But it was just 2 strands that they showed. But again, this is new science. So, on June 24th, 1992, the trial had wrapped up. The jury deliberated for a whopping 90 minutes, and they came back and they found Stewart Heaton guilty of murder. At the sentencing portion of the trial, a woman would come forward to state that at a Halloween party in 1986, she had gotten drunk at a party where Stewart was. She woke up in the middle of the night, and Stewart was sexually assaulting her. She was only 15 years old. The same age basically as Krystal. That victim's friend would come forward to state that she overheard Stewart saying, I will take care of the alleged victim. Meaning, I'll take care of, meaning like, I'll do something to her. They didn't report it because they were terrified to report it, because they didn't know if it would get them hurt, killed, or something. Another woman testifies at the sentencing trial that when she turned down Stewart's advances for a relationship or sexual stuff, he got really mad. And so he took a big old rock and he scratched the shit out of her car. And he was arrested for that, but charges were eventually dismissed. They had several witnesses who would just come forward to show that when Stewart is rejected in terms of sexual advances, relationship stuff, he reacts in a very big, in a very, kind of cruel way. He is also, there's witnesses to state that he has committed sexual assaults before. And so he would end up being sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would go on to the show Unsolved Mysteries. And the episode was about, because they already had the conviction, the episode was more about his potential innocence because of this DNA thing. And even when the episode aired, DNA was still very new. And the DNA seemed to be the key thing in this whole case. And that is essentially what convicted him. And he continued to swear up and down, he didn't do this, wasn't me. He was interviewed on the Unsolved Mysteries episode from prison, stating he didn't do this, it wasn't me, the DNA is wrong, it's wrong, can't be me. And he continued to try to appeal, and he kept trying to fight for new testing and all of this. And he just kept losing that battle. There would be, I guess, a lawyer, his lawyer after the fact would kind of do some more research and notice that there were at least 100 extremely similar white pickup trucks that were owned by people in that direct area where Krystal was killed. But they never looked at any of those people because they already had Stewart Heaton. The interesting thing is Krystal Naab's boyfriend at the time, drove a white pickup truck. There was also someone, I guess a local man who was older, who had apparently been seen threatening Krystal for some reason, and he also drove a white pickup truck. And he had a very long list of a criminal background. So there was a lot of stuff in his past. A prosecutor said that they were made aware of that man during, the initial investigation. And they claimed they really looked into him and they were able to rule him out. Did they test his DNA? I don't know. But I can tell you that the DNA with the boyfriend was tested and he could not have been the person to leave it. So despite him having a white truck, it likely wasn't him. Years later, they would bring in several experts to show that, listen, this DNA testing was not perfect back then. It's a little bit better now. They had experts who stated that the DNA only showed a potential chance of it being him. Experts would say, no, it's pretty clear that it was his DNA, and there was a lot of just conflicting back and forth reports. The DNA was the whole thing. That pretty much was the entire thing of this case. Even I have to admit, going back to the beginning, the fact that Krystal's brother, the first person he thought of was Stuart Heaton, who he himself admitted he hadn't seen in 3 years, who didn't even know if he even still owned a white pickup truck. It just seemed odd that that's the first person he would go to immediately as to when police asked him who owned a white pickup truck, knowing full well that her boyfriend owned one, and this man who had been threatening her that the family knew had also owned one. It's just interesting that that's the first person he goes to. Then the odds of him having those same cuts on his hands that would have been with the scissors, those are crazy odds. There would be a point in 1999 or so when Stuart was granted an evidentiary hearing and post-conviction evidentiary hearing. But eventually he was denied any kind of new trial or anything like that. And then another time he would get another evidentiary hearing where a witness would come forward to state that this witness overheard Krystal's brother Curtis basically had an unpaid drug debt with a drug dealer, and that this witness found out that the person he owed the drug debt to said he would hurt his sister if he didn't get his money. And this person who would have done that, was actually seen with Krystal in the days leading up to her murder. But there were no witnesses who could claim that they saw this man with her on the day of the murder. And then, in July of 2001, a judge would rule that because of the now crazy advancements in DNA testing, far different than it was back in the early 90s, the judge said Stuart is absolutely entitled to a new DNA test. That we can take that DNA and we can just confirm that it is his or not his. And so they run the DNA, they plug it against his known DNA sample, against the semen found on Krystal's body, and it proved that Stuart was the killer. This new DNA test, because obviously now we can actually pinpoint it and match it to an exact person. So the odds of the semen coming from a white male other than Stuart would have been 1 in 31 billion. It was confirmed. He says he never had sex with her. He never even met her that day. He wasn't there. So that was his words. This DNA said, nope, that was yours. Unequivocally yours and nobody else's. There is no chance on hell, no chance on this earth that there is anyone else who could have left that DNA other than Stuart Heaton. He, of course, would come forward to say, well, I want it to be tested again because they didn't test the DNA found in the body. That DNA probably they just tested it against my own DNA. Okay. I'm sure there were plenty of people who can corroborate that was not the case, but I'm sure they'll be happy to do it again, right? And prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that they're taking the DNA sample left from the body, comparing it to his DNA. He did it. Despite everything, despite all of it, he did it. It was him. And so, in the end, Krystal Naab, despite it being kind of uncertain for probably about a decade or so, even though they had a guy in jail, Krystal Naab did get the justice she rightfully deserved. But That is it for this case, True Crime, a Rooney Dooney Dingleberry Dongs. I hope you found it interesting. And until the next case, I shall see you then. Okay. Ta-ta for now, True Crime, a Rooney Dooney Dingleberry Dongs.